The Phoenix sun blazed mercilessly overhead as 12-year-old Marcus Thompson pressed his face against the living room window, watching two men in dark suits approach their front door. His mother, Sarah, stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from another double shift at the hospital, while his father, Robert, sat hunched over a stack of papers at the dining table, his calloused carpenter's hands trembling slightly. The house that had been their sanctuary for 8 years now felt like a trap closing around them. The doorbell's chime echoed through rooms that had once been filled with laughter and Sunday morning pancake aromas. Now they carried the weight of whispered arguments about mortgage payments and the lingering scent of his father's desperation. Marcus had heard the conversations his parents thought he couldn't understand, the ones that happened after he pretended to be asleep. Words like foreclosure and underwater and subprime had become part of his vocabulary in ways no child should know. Through the window, Marcus could see Mrs. Henderson from next door peeking through her curtains, and the Johnsons across the street had stepped onto their porch with coffee cups in hand, pretending to check their mail. The whole neighborhood knew what was happening. Everyone knew the Thompsons were about to lose everything, yet not a single person had knocked on their door to offer help. Not when Robert lost his construction job 6 months ago. Not when Sarah's hours at the hospital were cut in half. Not when they started selling furniture to make payments. "We need to let them in," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning unit they couldn't afford to run much longer. Robert stood slowly, his shoulders carrying the weight of failure that no man should bear alone. As he reached for the door handle, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a hardening that would stay with him for years to come. These weren't just men in suits. They represented something larger, something monstrous that could reach into your life and tear away everything you'd built, everything you'd dreamed of, everything that made you feel safe in the world. The door opened, and Marcus heard words that would echo in his nightmares for the next decade. "Mr. Thompson, we're here to execute the foreclosure order. You have 30 minutes to gather your personal belongings." The man's voice was neither cruel nor kind, simply mechanical, as if he were reading ingredients from a cereal box rather than destroying a family's life. Behind him, a locksmith waited with new keys that would transform their home into someone else's property. Marcus watched his mother collapse into a chair, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. His father nodded numbly, accepting defeat with the quiet dignity of a man who had fought every battle he could fight and lost them all. But Marcus felt something different burning in his 12-year-old heart. Not acceptance, not defeat, something that would grow into determination, then obsession, then revolution. "Mom," he said quietly, walking to her side and placing his small hand on her trembling shoulder. "Someday, I'm going to make sure this never happens to us again. I promise." Sarah looked up at her son with eyes full of love and heartbreak, not knowing that this moment would define the trajectory of his entire life. She couldn't have imagined that 16 years later Marcus would walk back through this same front door, not as a victim of the system, but as its conqueror. 16 years had passed since that devastating day in Phoenix, but Marcus Thompson could still taste the dust and desperation every time he drove through neighborhoods lined with foreclosure signs. Now 28, he sat in his cramped Austin apartment, surrounded by multiple computer monitors displaying charts, graphs, and cryptocurrency exchanges that most people couldn't begin to understand. The irony wasn't lost on him that he lived in a rented space by choice, not necessity, while his Bitcoin wallet contained enough digital wealth to buy a mansion. The apartment walls were covered with printouts of blockchain transactions, white papers about decentralized finance, and newspaper clippings from 2008 that he'd collected over the years like evidence in a crime scene investigation. His neighbors probably thought he was either a day trader or completely insane. They weren't entirely wrong on either count. What they couldn't see was the methodical brilliance behind his apparent obsession, the way he transformed childhood trauma into adult expertise. Marcus had spent the last decade studying every aspect of the traditional banking system that had destroyed his family. dissecting its weaknesses like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. He understood mortgage-backed securities, credit default swaps, and fractional reserve banking better than most finance professionals. But more importantly, he understood Bitcoin not just as an investment, but as a weapon against the very institutions that had made his mother cry and his father surrender his dignity. His phone buzzed with a text from David Chen, his former college roommate who had first introduced him to cryptocurrency in 2012. "Dude, you seeing this? Bitcoin just hit $50,000. Your parents still think you're crazy?" Marcus smiled, remembering the countless conversations where his parents had begged him to get a real job instead of what they saw as gambling with computer money. They'd watched him work 3 jobs while putting every spare dollar into something they couldn't touch or understand. Sarah still worked at the hospital, though she'd never fully recovered from the stress of losing their home. She'd developed anxiety that made her count and recount their monthly expenses, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Robert had eventually found work again, but something in his eyes had dimmed permanently. The confidence that comes from believing you can protect your family forever broken beyond repair. They lived in a modest apartment now, comfortable but cautious, and Marcus sent them money every month that they reluctantly accepted but never discussed. The computer screen reflected his face as he stared at his portfolio, numbers that represented more than wealth to him. They represented independence, security, and most importantly, the power to say no to any institution that might try to control his life. Every time Bitcoin's price increased, he felt a small victory against the system that had crushed his childhood innocence. Every transaction that bypassed traditional banks was a middle finger raised to the men in suits who had walked into his living room 16 years ago. But success in the digital realm couldn't fill the emotional void that failure had carved into his family. Marcus had built himself a fortress of financial independence, yet he remained isolated within it, afraid to fully trust anyone or anything that might be taken away. He'd learned to hoard his resources and guard his vulnerabilities, becoming strong in all the ways his father couldn't be, yet somehow smaller in all the ways that mattered for human connection. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, as Bitcoin continued its relentless climb toward heights that financial experts had once declared impossible, Marcus felt something stirring that he hadn't experienced in years. Not just the satisfaction of being right about technology, but something that felt dangerously close to hope. The coffee shop on South Lamar buzzed with the typical Austin energy of entrepreneurs, musicians, and tech workers, but Marcus barely noticed the ambient noise as he stared at the email that had arrived that morning. The subject line read, "Regarding the Thompson property, 1247 Desert Rose Drive, Phoenix." His childhood home, the place where his innocence had died, was back on the market. The current owners had defaulted on their mortgage, creating a bitter cycle that felt like cosmic justice demanding his attention. Marcus had been tracking the property for years through public records, watching it change hands 3 times since his family's foreclosure. Each new owner had eventually succumbed to the same financial pressures that had destroyed the Thompsons, as if the house itself carried a curse that traditional financing couldn't break. Now it sat empty again, another casualty of a system designed to benefit lenders rather than families seeking homes. "You look like someone just told you Bitcoin crashed to zero," came a voice from behind him. Marcus turned to see Elena Rodriguez, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that held decades of wisdom and regret. He'd met her 6 months ago at a cryptocurrency meetup, where she'd surprised everyone by being the most knowledgeable person in the room about blockchain technology despite her age. "Something like that," Marcus replied, sliding the laptop screen toward her so she could see the real estate listing. Elena's expression changed immediately, her face softening with understanding that went beyond casual sympathy. She knew his story because she'd shared her own over coffee one afternoon, a confession that had shaken Marcus to his core. Elena Rodriguez had been an executive at Wells Fargo during the 2008 crisis. She'd signed foreclosure documents, approved predatory loans, and participated in the systematic destruction of communities across America. But unlike her colleagues who'd collected bonuses and moved on, Elena had experienced something that financial institutions rarely encounter: a conscience. She'd retired early, liquidated her pension, and spent the last 15 years trying to atone for her role in the crisis by helping its victims navigate alternative financial systems. "This is your childhood home," she said quietly, not asking but stating a fact with the certainty of someone who understood trauma's geography. Marcus nodded, surprised by how much it meant to have someone recognize the significance without needing explanation. Most people saw real estate as just another investment opportunity, but Elena understood that houses carried emotional weight that transcended market value. "I've been thinking about buying it," Marcus admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Not to live in, but to, I don't know, complete some kind of circle." Elena leaned back in her chair, studying his face with the intensity of someone reading between lines for hidden meanings. "With Bitcoin," she said, and again it wasn't a question. "You want to use the currency they said was worthless to buy back the house they said you couldn't afford." Marcus felt exposed, as if Elena could see directly into his soul and understand motivations he'd barely acknowledged to himself. The irony was perfect in its symmetry. The same financial system that had declared his family unworthy of home ownership had also dismissed Bitcoin as a speculative bubble with no real value. Now, years later, that worthless digital currency had grown powerful enough to challenge the very institutions that had once seemed untouchable. Marcus possessed the means to walk back into his childhood trauma and emerge victorious, armed with technology that made traditional banks irrelevant. "The question," Elena continued, her voice gentle but probing, "is whether buying it back will heal the wound or just dress it in expensive bandages." Her words cut through his excitement with surgical precision, forcing him to confront the difference between revenge and recovery. Marcus stood in the driveway of 1247 Desert Rose Drive, his hands shaking slightly as he held the keys that had cost him 4.7 Bitcoin to acquire. The house looked smaller than his memories had painted it, weathered by Arizona sun and neglect, with a "for sale by owner" sign still leaning against the mailbox like a forgotten gravestone. The irony burned in his chest. He'd just purchased his childhood home with digital currency that hadn't existed when his family was forced to leave. Elena stood beside him, having insisted on making the trip from Austin to witness what she called his financial resurrection. She'd helped him navigate the complex process of converting Bitcoin to cash without triggering excessive government scrutiny, using her decades of banking experience to legitimize what most people still considered play money. The seller had been baffled but grateful, accepting Marcus's all-cash offer without question in a market where traditional financing had become increasingly difficult. "How does it feel?" Elena asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the desert wind that rustled through the palm trees his father had planted when Marcus was 7. Those trees had grown tall in the 16 years since the foreclosure, their roots now deep enough to survive droughts that might have killed them as saplings. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. Marcus walked slowly toward the front door, each step carrying the weight of 16 years' worth of anger, determination, and obsession. The paint was different now, a beige that had replaced his mother's beloved sage green, and the flower beds she'd tended with religious devotion had been paved over with gravel. But the bones of the house remained the same, the structure that had housed his dreams before the world taught him that dreams could be foreclosed upon. He slipped the key into the lock, and for a moment, time collapsed. He was 12 again, watching men in suits change the locks while his mother sobbed, and his father accepted defeat with devastating grace. But now, he was the man with the keys, the one with the power to determine who belonged and who didn't. The lock turned smoothly, and Marcus pushed open the door to confront his past. The interior was empty, stripped of the warmth that had once made it home. His footsteps echoed on hardwood floors, where his mother had taught him to dance to oldies music on Sunday mornings. The kitchen, where his father had helped him with math homework, was just empty cabinets and bare countertops now. But Marcus could still see the ghost of their former life in every corner, memories that no foreclosure could ever truly erase. Elena followed him inside, her presence both comforting and challenging. She represented everything he'd been fighting against, yet her genuine remorse and dedication to redemption had complicated his simple narrative of good versus evil. Life, he was learning, rarely offered the clean victories his younger self had imagined. "Now what?" she asked, her question hanging in the air of the empty house like a challenge to his soul. Marcus had achieved something he'd dreamed about for 16 years, but the victory felt hollow, incomplete. Owning the house didn't resurrect his childhood innocence or undo his parents' trauma. It was just a building with expensive memories attached. Standing in the living room where his world had once ended, Marcus realized that true healing might require something more complex than simply reversing his family's financial defeat. 3 weeks after purchasing the house, Marcus received an unexpected phone call that would transform his victory from personal vindication into something larger. Jennifer Martinez, a single mother of 2, had found his number through the neighborhood association and was calling with desperate hope in her voice. Her family was facing foreclosure on a house just 6 blocks away from his childhood home, trapped in the same predatory loan cycle that had destroyed the Thompsons 16 years earlier. "I heard you bought the Thompson place with that Bitcoin money," Jennifer said during their meeting at a local diner, her words carrying the skepticism of someone who'd learned not to trust financial miracles. "My kids heard about it at school. Everyone's talking about how you beat the banks at their own game." Her eyes held the same exhaustion Marcus remembered seeing in his mother's face, the weight of trying to protect children from adult failures. Elena had suggested the meeting after Marcus confided his growing restlessness about owning an empty house that felt more like a museum of trauma than a home. "Maybe," Elena had said with the wisdom of someone who'd spent years seeking redemption, "your real victory isn't in getting your house back, but in making sure other families don't lose theirs." Her words had planted a seed that Jennifer's call had watered into possibility. Marcus studied Jennifer across the diner table, seeing himself at 12 years old in her 10-year-old daughter Sophia, who sat quietly coloring while the adults discussed financial catastrophe in careful euphemisms. The girl's concentration reminded him of his own childhood coping mechanisms, the way he'd learned to disappear into activities while his world crumbled around him. "How much do you owe?" Marcus asked, pulling out his phone to access his Bitcoin wallet. The answer was $60,000, a sum that represented catastrophic debt to Jennifer's family, but merely a fraction of Marcus's cryptocurrency holdings. The mathematical simplicity of the solution stood in stark contrast to the emotional complexity of the gesture. Jennifer's eyes widened when Marcus showed her his phone screen, the Bitcoin balance that could solve her family's crisis with a simple digital transfer. "I can't accept charity," she whispered, pride and desperation wrestling in her voice. "There has to be some way I can pay you back." Marcus felt Elena's influence in his response, the older woman's lessons about dignity and redemption shaping his next words. "Not charity," Marcus replied, his mind racing toward possibilities he'd never considered. "Partnership. What if we created a new kind of lending system, one that uses cryptocurrency to help families avoid the traditional banking traps that destroyed both our childhoods?" Jennifer's expression shifted from disbelief to cautious hope, while Sophia looked up from her coloring to listen to adults discussing something that sounded dangerously close to the fairy tale endings she read in books. For the first time since buying his childhood home, Marcus felt the stirrings of purpose that transcended personal victory. 1 year later, Marcus stood in the backyard of his childhood home, now transformed into the headquarters of the Phoenix Home Recovery Project. The empty house had found new purpose as an office and meeting space for families navigating financial crisis, while the backyard hosted weekend barbecues where former strangers shared stories of survival and hope. His parents had flown in from their Austin apartment, witnessing their son's transformation from trauma-driven Bitcoin obsessive to community healer. Elena worked at a desk in what had once been Marcus's bedroom, using her banking expertise to help families understand their options before foreclosure became inevitable. Jennifer Martinez served as the project's community coordinator, her personal experience with near homelessness making her uniquely qualified to connect with desperate families. Together, they'd helped 17 families save their homes using a combination of cryptocurrency loans, financial education, and strategic intervention with lenders. "You know what the most beautiful thing is?" Sarah Thompson said to her son as they watched children play in the yard where Marcus had once felt his world collapse. "You took the worst day of our lives and turned it into the reason other families get to keep their worst days from happening." Her words carried the healing that only a mother's recognition could provide, acknowledgement that his 16-year journey had led somewhere worthy of the pain it cost. Robert approached his son with the kind of pride that can only come from watching your child surpass your own dreams for them. "I wish I'd been strong enough to fight back then," he said quietly, his voice still carrying traces of the shame that had defined him since 2008. Marcus embraced his father, understanding finally that strength comes in many forms, and that Robert's gentle surrender had protected his family from battles that might have destroyed them completely. The Phoenix sun was setting as Marcus walked through rooms that had once held only ghosts, now alive with conversations about blockchain technology, community organizing, and the revolutionary idea that money could serve families rather than institutions. His Bitcoin wallet was significantly lighter than it had been a year ago, but his life felt immeasurably richer. David Chen called as Marcus locked up the house for the evening, his voice excited about Bitcoin's latest price surge. "Dude, you could have been a millionaire by now if you hadn't given so much away," David teased, not understanding that Marcus had already achieved something more valuable than individual wealth. Standing in the driveway where his childhood had ended, Marcus realized that true victory hadn't come from beating the system that destroyed his family, but from building a better system that protected other families from the same destruction. The boy who had promised his mother that this would never happen again had kept his word, not just for them, but for an entire community that now knew homes could exist beyond the reach of traditional banks.